I'm Jerry G., the Vice President of Instruction at North Idaho College, and I, along with you, have quite an opportunity this afternoon to hear from an extremely distinguished group of individuals. So what we'd like to do is have each one of these individuals spend just a few minutes with you, giving some prepared remarks. Then we'll open it up for questions, and then after that, we'll give each one of them an opportunity to share just a little bit about the role they've played and what they've received from this endeavor. So, to get started, it's my pleasure to present to you Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet member and Secretary of Labor under Franklin Roosevelt.
Good afternoon. My name is Frances Perkins. As a Mount Holyoke alumnus, I'm especially honored to be here today to address the graduating class. I have been asked to tell you how my own career has directly affected the future all of you face as you begin your own working lives. So I'm going to forego modesty today and tell you that I believe that the labor and social reforms for which I fought as Secretary of Labor and devoted over 45 years of my life to have had a positive relevance for every young woman and man in the American workforce. I am best known as the first woman to serve in the cabinet. I was Secretary of Labor under Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the entire 12 years and 3 months of his presidency, which I believe is a record both for a president and for a cabinet member. William Wirtz, the Secretary of Labor under President Johnson, once honored me by saying that every man and every woman who works for a living wage under safe conditions for reasonable hours or who is protected by unemployment insurance or Social Security is her debtor. I was very honored by those statements. However, I always just prefer to think of myself as a woman born in my own time. I was born Fannie Coralie Perkins in 1882 on April 10th in Boston, Massachusetts, to middle-class parents who were traditional New England Yankees, frugal and hardworking, and they expected me to grow up to be the traditional wife and mother, but I had surprises in store. After high school, I went to Mount Holyoke College, which was a women's college in New England, and I graduated in 1902 with a degree in chemistry. After a frustrating 2 years back home, trying to figure out what I was going to do, I took a job teaching chemistry at a small private girls' school outside of Chicago, Illinois. One day I attended a lecture, and that lecture happened to be by Jane Addams, who was currently working in the Hull House settlement in Chicago. Very soon, I left teaching for good and went to join Ms. Addams at Hull House. I was inspired by the women I worked for and appalled by the conditions that I saw in the factories. I decided to pursue further education and a professional career in social work. For the next several years, I worked and studied and eventually got my master's from Columbia University in philanthropy, which today would be known as social work. And I went to work for the New York Consumers League, which investigated factory conditions. In 1911, my life changed forever when I witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. In that fire, 146 young women, most of them still teenagers, were killed trying to escape from the fire. The reason for that was because the owners had locked the doors from the outside so that they couldn't leave during their shifts. From that point on, I was completely committed to improving working conditions for all Americans, but especially for women who seem to have so much less protection in the workplace. In 1913, 2 events helped chart my future course. I became Director of Investigations for the New York State Factory Commission, working closely with such New York State legislators as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Al Smith, and Robert Wagner. In September of that year, I married Paul Wilson, who soon became the Executive Secretary for the current Mayor of New York. I retained my maiden name so that my unconventional career would not damage my husband's. It was not a feminist statement, nor was it a statement against my husband. I want that to be clear. In 1916, my daughter Susanna was born, and I cut back on work for several years to be a full-time mother, which I always did believe was the role that most women preferred the most. However, fate had other plans for me, and in 1923, Al Smith, who is now the governor of New York, appointed me to the State Industrial Board, and I retained that post when FDR became governor. In 1929, I became commissioner of the New York State Factory Commission, and in 1933, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the presidency, he called me to Washington. I accepted the post of Secretary of Labor to work for God, for FDR, and for the millions of plain, forgotten, common working men. And I also had private economic reasons for agreeing to serve. My husband was unable to work and was frequently hospitalized, so I became the sole support of my family for most of its existence. The Department of Labor also housed the Women's and Children's Bureaus, where a lot of my old friends from Hull House were currently working, including Grace Abbott and Julia Lathrop. Finally, I did feel a duty to other women to walk through the door that FDR had opened for me, so that in the future, other women could walk through the door. The next few years saw the realization of my most cherished reforms for all Americans. First, I fought for and won the inclusion of Title VIIa in the National Recovery Act, or Wagner Act. This guaranteed that American workers were given the right to unionize without interference and the right to bargain collectively. I was really disappointed when the Supreme Court overturned that. However, John L. Lewis and other labor leaders took that as a mandate, and labor rules soared. The Fair Labor Standards Act established minimum wages and maximum hours for scores of American workers and put strict limits on child labor. And that act, I am told, is still being amended again today. Grace Abbott and Julia Lathrop, who I've already mentioned, were then the heads of the Children's Bureau, and they worked tirelessly with me to draft that legislation. In 1935, my proudest political moment arrived. On August 14th, I witnessed the signing of the Social Security Act. I had served as the chairman on the President's Committee for Economic Security for 1 year. We were given 1 year by Congress to prepare that entire act. We had no budget because they forgot to appropriate one, so we rounded up volunteers and went to work. That act guaranteed old age insurance, unemployment insurance, and aid to families with dependent children for all Americans. I wished I had included health insurance because we still are not in a place where we have good health insurance for the whole country, but we just ran out of time. The Social Security Act was a complete triumph for Americans, but it was not a triumph for the Department of Labor. In fact, at the culmination of it all, instead of putting the Social Security Administration under the Department of Labor, a new board was created, and this was a great disappointment to me. It was also a day of sadness for me because I had received a call as I left for the signing that my husband was missing from the hospital in which he was living. And I went to the signing, and I smiled for the pictures, and then I left for the train to New York, where I eventually found my husband wandering the streets. It really reminded me of the pitfalls of such a public life, and I never spoke publicly about my private life during my lifetime, and the reason for that is because I never wanted my husband or my daughter to be embarrassed about their private troubles or struggles because of my public persona. Anyway, I served until President Roosevelt died, and then I served for 2 months longer, at which point President Truman graciously accepted my resignation. However, an old bureaucrat never dies, they just are reappointed. And the next year, I came back, and I was nominated by President Truman to serve on the Civil Service Commission. I did that until 1952. So now I stand here trying to explain how my efforts helped shape the working world into which you now enter. American workers today are guaranteed a minimum wage and no longer work 16 hours or more without proper compensation. Women who were terribly abused in the factories are now approaching a level of equity, and I charge you all to continue to work to achieve full equality for women in today's workplace. And finally, I'm going to paraphrase my own comments at a 1960 anniversary gathering for the Social Security Administration and say that Social Security is so firmly embedded in the American psychology today that no politician, no political party, no political group could possibly destroy this act and preserve our democratic system. It is safe forever and for the benefit of the American people. And I hope that all political leaders of the 21st century, both men and women, remember this.
Thank you very much. Our next guest is a former senator from the state of Arizona and a presidential candidate, Barry Goldwater. Senator Goldwater.
Thank you very much. I don't exactly share the same zeal for Ms. Perkins and her quest for the New Deal administration as under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You see, those policies were enacted after the Great Depression. And, you know, the Great Depression did last 10 years. And I wonder if those New Deal policies, in fact, prolonged the New Deal, or the Depression. The real issue here is that when you inject all of this money into the system, through this Keynesian economic theory, what really happens is it shrinks the ability of businesses to grow. And I don't believe that is going to be good for the economy in the long term. Now, perhaps if we would have elected Hoover, who very well knew exactly the differences of administration and how to effectively move supplies, and he did that during actually World War I, is where he got his administrative experience. If we would have elected a good conservative, I believe we would have had a much shorter Great Depression. Also, if we didn't elect another Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, who got us into World War I, which we should have stayed out of, if he wouldn't have elected him and subsequent foreign policy that funded the Germans to pay back the British to pay us back, which was really, I believe, one of the major causes for the Depression, we wouldn't have had such economic chaos. So my message here today is that we need to focus exactly on the economic issues in order to best expand our economy. As a young boy, I grew up in Arizona. I remember my mom, she sewed another star on our flag, and that was because Arizona became a state. That imbibed within me a very great sense of patriotism. Ever since then, I've felt that as Americans, we need to cherish our liberty and our libertarian heritage. Because when we are most free, we are mostly a people if we can be mostly free. Subsequently, I ran for the Senate later in my life in the 50s, and I did win that election. I served and I became known as a spokesman, a straight shooter who talked what he said, what he thought, and talked about what he said. Sometimes I don't always come across very clearly. However, I think it's important to recognize that once we were in Congress and we did have a conservative upbringing, we did start to see good economic tides again. You may remember the golden age of prosperity. It was also in a time where conservatives were having more and more of an influence on economic policy. I don't think that's just a simple matter of correlation. I think it's a matter of causation. Now, after this came, we saw President Kennedy, and around that time, I was beginning to campaign for the office of presidency. Unfortunately, my dear friend Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and I immediately decided I no longer wanted to run for office, the office of the President of the United States. I was very disheartened at that time because I had a very close relationship with President Kennedy. We had set up a plan to have a series of Lincoln-Douglas-style debates because we felt that the American people should have a choice between two politicians who are telling them what they think and setting an example for which positions we should have. Later on, however, I noticed Lyndon Johnson was going to run for president, and I felt that I needed to rise up to challenge him because I didn't feel that he was presenting a very healthy option for the American people. Other conservatives like Rockefeller ran against me and for the Republican nomination. I think they were very furious when they did see that I was gaining support against them. Rockefeller, however, did lose, and the major power of the Republican Party shifted from the east back to the west. And it set up a new example of what it means to be a conservative. What it means to be a conservative is that you must value individual freedom. That means you must value individuals' freedom not only in the economic sense, but also in the personal sense. You must let people choose to live their lives how they want to live it. We must not engage in petty matters of religious bickering of the sort. For instance, my father, he was Jewish. My mother, she was a Presbyterian. I was raised Episcopalian. But I never really understood the Judaic religion because my father, he wouldn't talk about it. And my mother, she didn't talk about it, her Presbyterian religion much. But I was raised to kind of seek out for our own. And I realized that you can find God walking through the Grand Canyon of my great state of Arizona. You can find God walking on a mountaintop. You can find God in a forest just as well as you can find God in a church. And so for each his own, he must find his own spiritual innermost strength. And the issue is not to be petty about our religious differences. Consequently, what I've noticed, after I actually did not win the presidential nomination, it was not exactly the best showing by a candidate. I believe I lost to that election by the largest landslide in history. But nonetheless, I think my message did get across that individual freedom is more important than petty religious bickering. And consequently, the Republican Party shifted more to the right. We shifted more towards individual freedom. I was very pleased when my friend Ronald Reagan got elected president. He had this similar philosophy, carried it out very nicely. But then his predecessor, George Bush, really disappointed me. He took the Republican Party back to be in control of the religious right. And what we saw there was they were talking about abortion. Well, the way I feel is the American people believe that that is an individual choice, and I believe that as well. Well, that's going to cause a serious divide among the Republican Party, and I believe we're seeing that right now with possible third-party candidates taking away from the Republican support, like Pat Buchanan. But the issue of the religious right forcing its own personal agenda on the Republican Party will be the Republican Party's downfall. I said that back in the 60s, and I will continue to say it now. Another issue that I think Republicans ought to support is gay rights. I believe in gays in the military. They can shoot guns just as well as anyone else, so what's the problem? I don't think there is one. What really disappoints me today when I look around and I see American politics, I don't see straight shooters anymore. I see the likes of Albert Gore. I see the likes of George W. Bush, and they'll dance and tiptoe around the issues, but they won't say what they think. What kind of a democracy is that where you vote for someone who doesn't say what they think? That's no democracy. That is certainly no democracy. I believe that it was a real shame when we rejected the candidates of John McCain and Bill Bradley because they were straight shooters. They talked straight. Al Gore and Bill Bradley talk about as straight as your Highway 95. Yes, sir. I would like to conclude this, that I believe that we as a people need to move back to liberty. We need to focus on individual liberty. And to be extreme in that pursuit is certainly no vice. And I believe that's why I lost the presidential election of 1964, as I was being demagogued as an extremist. But I am certainly extreme. But that is no problem, because it's for liberty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. The next guest that I would like to introduce was the 33rd President of the United States, Harry Truman.
Well, I was hoping that my former honorable colleague in the Senate, the great Senator from Arizona Barry Goldwater, in the good conscience of a conservative, would have yielded most of his time to me, because Barry, you could have said all that about conservatism in about 15 seconds. I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you this afternoon. I am Harry S. Truman, 33rd President of the United States. I was born on May 8, 1884, and I left this world December 26, 1972. I was 60 years old when I became president. First 59 years of my life prepared me for the office of president. I was born in Lamar, Missouri, to good, hard-working, farming parents who, though very poor, provided me with a house full of books and a piano that enabled me to become a pretty fair country piano player for a politician. In high school, I translated Caesar's commentaries. I read every book in the school and the public library, including the encyclopedias, and I remembered everything. When I graduated from high school, I went to work on the railroad and then a couple banks in New York. But my father needed me back on the farm, and so I wound up working out in the fields, plowing and harvesting the crops and milking the cows. I know all about the hardships of farming. I later joined the Missouri Guard, and eventually, when I'm 34, I wound up in France as a captain of an artillery battery. When I returned home after the war, I married my childhood sweetheart that I've been in love with since the first grade in Sunday school. I went to work and established a haberdashery with my good friend, Eddie Jacobson. But a downturn in the economy, the business went sour, and I wound up a real failure. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to go back to the farm and sit on a plow and look at the rear end of a mule, because I guess that was a natural transition to the Democratic Party. Jim and Mike Pendergast suggested that I might be interested in running as county judge in Jackson County. Now, county judge is similar to county prosecutor that you know about today. We built roads and buildings and created jobs that you need different service, provided the services you need in the county. And so I liked that job, and I did a pretty good job, but I lost for re-election in 1924, and then did some odd jobs, and in 1926, I ran for presiding judge. And I was elected to that position in November 1924, or 26, pardon me, and I held that position for 8 years. I built $7 million worth of highways that would help farmers get their products to market. I built a beautiful courthouse in Jackson County with a statue of my hero, Andrew Jackson. It created all kinds of jobs for people. I did such a good job, I was asked to run for the United States Senate by Tom Pendergast. I was one of about 3 or 4 candidates he picked. Maybe Tom didn't think I had a chance of winning, and he wanted to get me out of politics because I never gave him any jobs that he bid on. All the jobs that were bid on when I was county judge went to companies and corporations out of state because they bid the lowest amount, and I saved the taxpayers all kinds of money. And when I left as county judge, I was economically worse off than I had been when I started. You're not going to get rich in politics unless you're a crook. In the election of 1934, I won the primary and the general election, and I was off to the United States Senate in Washington, D.C. Not long after arriving in the Senate, old Ham Lewis, the whip of the House, or the Senate, said, "Harry, the first 6 months you're here, you'll wonder, how the hell did you get here?" And the next 6 months, you'll wonder, how the hell did the rest of them get here? I formed a fast relationship with a very great person, Justice Louis Brandeis. And we talked about the bigness of American business and corporations. And I made a speech in the Senate that our basic problem was uncontrolled greed and avarice. In 1940, I was elected to my second term in the Senate. And not long after, World War II started. I was asked to chair a committee, the National Committee on Defense. And we were to investigate all the war factories and the military bases where construction was going on and make sure everything was done right. So the other senators on my committee and myself traveled across all the states of the nation in our own automobiles. I put about 40,000 miles on my own beat-up little Chrysler. And what we discovered was there was all kinds of awful graft and corruption and waste going on. And the work of that committee saved the taxpayers millions and millions of dollars. In fact, we financed 3 more Army divisions to serve in Europe and the Pacific. My work on that committee enabled me to be mentioned for a possible candidacy as vice president. And at the National Convention, I was, by circumstance and politics, nominated unanimously to be vice president. Franklin Delano Roosevelt won an unprecedented 4th term, and I was the vice president. I shall never forget that April afternoon. I had just come from the Senate floor and was in Speaker Rayburn's office. We were the Board of Education, a group of us discussing political events, and I was having some bourbon and water with the rest of the senators, and a phone call came from the White House that I should come over. I didn't think anything of it. I ran to the White House. Through the Capitol building, I hitched a ride to the White House. Upon arriving there, I was escorted to Mrs. Roosevelt's quarters, and to hear those solemn words, "Harry, the President is dead." Now I was faced with all those massive problems, all the big problems, and I would have to rely on all the help of the cabinet and everybody else to help me solve the problems, to bring a stable peace to Europe, whether to use the atomic bomb to end the war in the Pacific, to end the coal strikes and the railroad strikes. In 1946, at the State of the Union message, I asked Congress for a national health program for the American people who had no health coverage, children and poor people without health care. I asked the Congress for a far-reaching bill on civil rights to do away with the disgraceful, terrible, shameful lynch laws in the South. I asked for the abolition of the poll taxes to enable thousands of people to vote. I asked for retribution for the Japanese Americans for the shameful, terrible way we treated them at the beginning of World War II. That would not happen for another 45 years. I mention this to tell you how far we had come at that time and what we have left to do. I remind you of the great programs that Democratic administrations have established in the 20th century. I charge you today, I ask you today to continue those programs and that agenda in this new century. And when you go to vote in November, I'm asking you to pick up that Democratic ballot. I'm asking you to vote straight Democrat all the way.
Give them hell, Harry. Give them hell.
You will vote vote for yourself, you will vote for your children, you will vote for your nation, you will vote for humanity. I know that you will do that. I know that I can count on you. Thank you. God bless you. God bless America.
Thank you. It's my pleasure now to introduce to you Margaret Chase Smith, United States Senator from Maine, and the first woman to serve in both houses of Congress. Senator Smith.
President of the Senate, may I address the floor?
You may.
I would like to speak briefly and simply about a serious national condition. It is a national feeling of fear and frustration that could result in national suicide and the end of everything that Americans hold dear. Those of us who shout the loudest about Americanism and making character assassinations are all too frequently those who, by our own words and acts, ignore some of the basic principles of Americanism: the right to criticize, the right to hold unpopular beliefs, the right to protest, and the right to independent thought. The American people are sick and tired of being afraid to speak their minds lest they be smeared as communists or fascists by their opponents. Freedom of speech is not what it used to be in America. It has been so abused by some that it is not exercised by others. This speech was called The Politics of Conscience, and it was delivered to the Senate in a public attempt to put a stop to McCarthyism in America. This was often called my finest hour. Joseph McCarthy, as you may know, was a Republican senator from Wisconsin. In 1950, in a speech given to West Virginia, he raised up a sheet of paper and said, "I hold in my hand a list of 205 known communists currently working in the American State Department." Now you can imagine this would be instant headlines. Already Americans were uneasy about the communists, the Cold War, who to trust, who not to. And he was never able to produce these documents. And that's one of the reasons why it took me so long to speak against this. I was waiting for these documents. And if anybody opposed him, he would blacken your reputation. There is an old saying in Maine, never speak unless you have to. I usually left the speaking making to someone else, but this time I've been quiet for too long. I remember something else I once heard: the only thing necessary for triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Well, at this time, good men were doing nothing, and not this woman. I was going to do something. So with the support of 6 other senators, I spoke my mind through the politics of conscience, and I was the first member of the Senate to stand up to Joe McCarthy in public. My name is Margaret Chase Smith, and you may know me as the senator from Maine who delivered the politics of conscience, the only woman to serve in both houses of Congress, the first woman to be elected to 4 full terms to the U.S. Senate, and also historians might remember me as the first woman in the country to be a serious candidate for the President of the United States. I was born in Skowhegan, Maine. My parents were George and Carrie, and they had 4 children, I being the oldest. I had a typical childhood. I preferred playing over school, even though I was a good student, not so good with the English grammar. I had a good memory. I always won the spelling bees. But I also liked gym class. In fact, I was on the basketball team. I played center, and we became the champions of the state of Maine. I also preferred working over practicing the piano. I remember one day I went into Green Brothers' 5 and 10 cent store, and I walked up to the manager and asked him for a job. And he looked at me kind of surprisingly, and I think he didn't know what to say, so he turned around and he said, "Well, once you're able to reach this top shelf, then we'll hire you. So every time I walked into the 5 and 10 cent store, I kind of walked over to the shelf and measure myself up to see how I measured against the shelves. By the age of 13, I finally was hired. This didn't get me out of the piano lessons, though. The only thing that got me out of the piano was switching to play clarinet. After that, I worked at the telephone company. I worked the switchboard. Now, working the switchboard, this is where I was first introduced to Clyde Smith. And he was a legend in the local politics, and he was always making phone calls to friends, old associates, and the legislature. And every time that he would call, I would catch my breath, and they answered so impressively. He would even call for the correct time, and I would give him the correct time to the precise second. I would say, "It is 8:31 and 19 seconds, Mr. Smith." Our paths crossed again years later. I was a circulation manager at the Independent Reporter, and he was now a state senator. At this time, I was in my late 20s, 30s, early 30s, and the 22 years age difference weren't so noticeable as I was a businesswoman. Now, at this time, my interests weren't going to movies or dancing. I watched Clyde speak, and I followed every new bill in both the state and federal legislature, and we were married in 1930. So my next career, I was a politician's wife. Together, we visited every corner of the state, said hello to old friends, met new ones. He was elected to Maine's 2nd District, and we moved to Washington, D.C. Since we've made such a good team, I became his secretary. Therefore, I worked 12 to 15 hour days running the office, taking care of the mail, conducting research on bills that Clyde had to vote for. After 1 year of his election, he had a heart attack. He recovered well and was reelected, but in 1940, he had another heart attack, and this one was a little more serious. And if you knew Clyde, you knew that he always had politics on his mind. So the doctor's concern was if we withdrew him from the re-election again, then his health would decline. And so he came up with this idea to put me on the ballot until he feels better, and then he can take my place. Well, after the statement went to the press, he suffered another heart attack and died. It's pretty typical for the wife to fill their husband's unexpired terms, and so I did, but remember, I was still on the ballot. In September of 1940, I was elected to the 77th Congress. I was in Congress from 1940 to 1949, and during my 8.5 years in the House of Representatives, I enjoyed many honors, but of all the accomplishments, most proud was that I pleased the voters of the 2nd District of Maine to send me back to Congress 4 consecutive terms. Now, I wonder how they would feel about sending me to the Senate. You know, Senator White was retiring, and typically the replacement is, since he was a Republican and I'm a Republican, the longest record of service, it would go towards the person with the longest service in the House of Representatives. Well, they had felt that I had a good seat in the House of Representatives and that I should stay there. That I would be turning my back on a lifetime job and end up a very sorry lady, because the U.S. Senate was a man's job. So I made the announcement that I would be entering the race for the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate. Publicly, I remained calm and confident, but inside I did have my doubts. With the campaign, I could only spend a few days a month, and that's all I could spare away from Washington. I had no campaign staff and very little money. The only chance that I had to win the primaries was to make myself known to Maine. So I had a calendar in one hand, a map in the other hand, and I was determined to cover the whole state. Because as Clyde always said, the only way to win an election was to get out and talk to the people. I called myself the can-do candidate with a can-did record. Don't trade a record for a promise. In September 13, 1948, I was elected to the U.S. Senate by the biggest majority that has ever been recorded in Maine election, polling over 71% of the vote. I was in the Senate from 1949 to 1973. My mother always asked me when I was going to stop all this nonsense and get married. I promised her if I didn't win, I'd think about it. Well, up to now, I haven't had much time. My job is my life. I have worked very hard for the citizens of Maine. This is my glory. I am dedicated to my job, my state, and my country. In the fall of 1963, my assistant told reporters that I was seriously considering entering the Republican primaries in 1964. With this announcement, also had some diverse reactions. From the women's group, they announced, "It's about time a woman took over the country." And from the men, the whole idea was unconstitutional. Anyways, Senator Barry Goldwater was nominated for the presidency in 1964 in the final ballot, but I polled the second highest number of votes in the Republican convention. It was once called a moment in history. Perhaps someday, not too distant in the future, the U.S. will elect a woman president. Perhaps maybe somebody in this room. If so, let me leave you with a few words of advice about being a lady politician. Be feminine, but not too feminine. Be friendly within reason. Listen more than you talk. Take care of home folks, and work, work, and work. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Our last guest this afternoon is 28th President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. President Wilson.
Thank you very much. My name is Thomas Woodrow Wilson. I served as president from 1912 until 1920. I was born in Georgia in 1856, December 28th, so that makes me a pretty old fellow. So, greetings, youngsters. I've always been a rather studious fellow, and as a result of that, why I excelled in school and finally went to Princeton University, where I graduated with a bachelor's degree. I went on to Johns Hopkins University and got a PhD. I then later joined the Princeton faculty. My area of expertise was political economy. Now that's a term that is used and has been, I think, confused with political science. I never considered that an accurate term, although it came into use later in my career. I never thought politics really was very scientific. In any case, I was on the faculty at Princeton for a number of years until finally I became the president of Princeton University. And 2 years after that, I guess I must have impressed some people, I was asked to run for governor of New Jersey. And I did, and I won that election. Perhaps my political economy background aided me in these endeavors. 2 years after I was governor of New Jersey, however, I was also asked to run for president of the United States based on my experience as governor and the fact that I seemed to be a good vote getter. And the political opposition was pretty weak. The Republican Party was split between Taft and Theodore Roosevelt. And I admire Theodore Roosevelt for his ability to project a very positive persona. But on the other hand, Bull Moose Party, I really felt that was stretching things a bit. I did get elected to the presidency in 1912, and one of the things that I've prided myself on is the fact that I was probably the first assertive president. Prior to my tenure, the leaders of the House and the Senate pretty much set the agenda for what was going to happen in the Houses of Congress. But I was very assertive and pushed through the Federal Reserve Act to stabilize the economy and the monetary picture in the United States. I also pushed through some laws that protected the workers from striking. They were able to legally strike under the bill that I pushed through. And they got some other advantages in terms of being able to organize. My wife, Ellen, however, in 1914, after a long illness, died. She was a very courageous woman. She really taught me how to die. About a year later, after I think a restrained romance, I married my second wife, Edith, who was with me through the remainder of my tenure as President of the United States. Edith was very supportive, and I loved her very much, and she helped me out as I had physical problems late in my second term. But let's get back to the presidency, which is, I assume, most of you are most interested in. The first term that I served made it possible for me to push through some legislation, but it also created some problems for me with foreign policy. I was very assertive in the area of foreign policy as well, and we were very distracted by the situation on our borders to the south. The Mexican people had great difficulty during that time, and so we thought that it would be a good idea to try to stabilize that nation. And so we pulled some strings and got President Huerta out of the picture and got President Carranza elected, but he wasn't any better than Huerta. And at this time, they were unable to stabilize the situation in Mexico, and so I sent Blackjack Pershing down there to take care of that scoundrel Pancho Villa, and he searched and searched and searched for him. Never did find him. Fortunately, he was much more successful when we sent him to Europe. Another foreign involvement that we had was the deteriorating circumstances in Haiti. And, we must adhere to the Monroe Doctrine, and so I sent the Marines into Haiti and made it a protectorate. I thought that was the decent thing to do to save our little brown brothers. About this time, the situation was deteriorating even more in Europe. As you know, the war had started in 1914, and we were urged to join the Allies while the war was going on. However, I was able to defer that until my second term and was elected with the idea that he kept us out of war. I was, of course, planning for war during my first term. One of the ways that helped me do this is I was the first president to establish a propaganda agency within the organization, within my administration. George Creel was of course, we did not call it the propaganda agency. That would not be good form. We called it the Office of Public Information. And George Creel was invaluable to me all during the time of the mobilization for war, and also to put the very best light on our involvement in the other foreign activities that we were engaged in. The war, of course, was a major factor in my administration. And we did mobilize the country very quickly, nationalized all of the industries, and sent 1.5 million men to Europe. And of course, that was the defining moment in the war. Although they were there a short time, it was generally acknowledged that that was the main reason why the war was concluded as quickly as it was. This was a real preoccupation for me. I drafted a set of 14 points that I thought would help create a situation in Europe and in the world that would be helpful to prevent another world war from ever happening. I pushed that through and in Europe. It was very successful. Unfortunately, I was less successful in the United States. It saddens me to tell you that the Senate in 1918 became dominated by the Republican Party, and they refused to accept the League of Nations, which was built upon my 14 points. I charged all over this nation, gave speeches and speeches and speeches to try to implore the people to override that Senate majority. I was unsuccessful. And that's when things really deteriorated in my health to the point where I was incapacitated for almost the entire last year of my administration. And without the help of my wife, Edith, it truly would have been a disaster. But I did live on after that, and I was fortunate enough to receive the Nobel Prize for Peace as a result of my efforts. But it was always a great disappointment for me to not have the United States part of the League of Nations to ensure world peace from that point on. I wanted to make the world safe for democracy and safe for American business interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you. At this time, we'll entertain questions from the audience, and if you'd ask a question, I'll repeat it so make sure everybody can hear it.
Dr. G, I have to go to the television program. I just want to do two things before I leave. I want to thank these wonderful people that have been working for 4 months, or 5 in some cases, are dedicated. We appreciate you very, very much. And I also want to recognize Dean Bennett, who's been here all week, and he's worked hard in all these sessions. It's because of staff like that we can do what we want to. Let's thank Dean Bennett.
What questions do you have for our panelists? Yes, over there. Okay.
I was wondering if it was true that he didn't want to be vice president, he wanted to stay senator, and he was kind of forced to be a vice president.
Okay. Question was of President Truman, did you really want to be a vice president or remain a senator?
I really did want to remain in the United States Senate. That was the height of my goals. But the Democratic leadership was not able to persuade any of the other candidates, and there were political reasons for it too. Jimmy Burns from the South, an outstanding senator, had been considered, and it looked like he was going to be the vice presidential candidate, but then other factions in the party thought that he was from the South, it would alienate a lot of votes in the North, and some in the South too. And so Jimmy went out of the picture. The Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas was, if he wanted it, it was his. But he wanted to remain on the Supreme Court. And Alvin Barkley was considered at that time too old even. And he'd be my vice president. And George Wallace was considered almost an outright communist, and would lose all kinds of votes. And so it came, Henry Wallace, pardon me. And so it came down to me. And they just told me I would run, and I would be the candidate, and it was a unanimous nomination. And that's where I found myself. I always considered myself a man of the Senate.
Thank you. Yes.
I have 2 questions, one for Senator Goldwater and then the second for President Truman. Senator Goldwater, what were your feelings on Mr. Perkins' ideas to make a national health care provided by the U.S. government, and also do you have any proposed solutions for the national debt that was created by the Reagan administration, and also for various problems occurring after that?
Let's see if we got these straight. They're for Senator Goldwater, and the first one dealt with the Perkins health care. Is that correct, Senator?
Yes, it is. Why, indeed. Thank you, young man. I certainly don't think a nationwide healthcare system would do anything to alleviate the national debt at this time. I believe that in order to completely pay down the debt, we have to allow that investment to expand. Now, keep in mind that what caused the national debt during the Reagan administration was needed to, it was spent on the military in order to win the Cold War against the communists. And if we didn't have invested so much money in spending on the military in order to win the Cold War against the communists, we may have had to either fight an actual hot war with the communists, which I don't think any of us would want to see our young men die, or let them win. And I don't think any of those two options were acceptable. So the national debt during the Reagan administration was, I believe, necessary. Now, things that we can do about this are, now that we have a growing economy, let it grow, keep taxes down low, don't pay for frivolous things like national health care, let individuals pay for that themselves. And that will solve that problem in the long term.
Thank you, Senator Goldwater. Your other question then for President Truman, is that correct?
Yes. I was wondering what your feelings were after the dropping of the atomic bomb, and if you had any comments on your reaction towards Robert Oppenheimer when he came in and expressed his guilt, his feelings of guilt and remorse after that.
After I became president and found out about this project, the Truman Committee had been advised that there was a big project going on in Hanford and Washington and Alamogordo, but we were to stay away from that completely. It was top secret, and I didn't find out a thing about it until the evening that the president died, and Secretary Henry Stimson told me that there was an extremely big, important project that was going on, and he came in the next day and then laid everything out before me, and I really was surprised by it. We had a committee set up to make the decision on dropping the atomic bomb. And that committee included the president of the New York Life Insurance Company, the presidents of Harvard and MIT, members of the cabinet, the secretaries, undersecretaries of defense and state and treasury, and Dr. Vannevar Bush and Dr. Robert Oppenheimer. And their decision and their advice, and the chiefs of staff of the generals and admirals were all there to, their advice was that if Japan was not going to surrender unconditionally very soon, we had to use that bomb on a location that would show a great amount of damage, that it had to be secret and without warning. At the Potsdam Conference, we issued an ultimatum on July 26th to the Japanese people that a great deal of destruction would be visited upon Japan and the Japanese people, and they should surrender immediately. On the 28th of July, that ultimatum was rejected outright, and Japan said they would continue to wage war wherever they could. I immediately sent the order to drop the bomb, but not before August 3rd, hoping that the Japanese would still surrender. And ultimately, we dropped the bomb. And the destruction was terrible. And Robert Oppenheimer, yes, he did come to see me and talk to me, and he was very distraught, blaming himself. I let him understand that I was the man that pulled the trigger. During the Korean War, other military leaders that thought we should use the bomb again, and I said, as long as I'm president, we will never use that bomb again. It is not a military weapon. It is a device that kills hundreds of thousands of defenseless, unarmed women and children. It's easy to look back and say we should have done something differently. But you cannot know the results of a decision that you did not make. You can only know the results of the decisions that you did make. And we, given the time and the circumstances and the mentality and the people at the time, I believe we did the right thing I made the right decision. We had lost 12,000 American soldiers in the last 2 weeks of the war in Okinawa. And hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers had died, and also on Iwo Jima. If we hadn't used that bomb, perhaps millions and millions and millions of people would have died in a continuing war. I made the right decision.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Yeah, here in the back.
Seems like we're picking on President Truman. This one is for President Truman. Mr. Truman, shortly after the detonation of the first nuclear device on July 16, 1945, a number of the Manhattan Project investigators signed a report which became known as the Frank Report, named after James Frank, in which they encouraged you to do a demonstration explosion of another nuclear device for the Japanese, which might cause them to surrender then immediately instead of using the bomb on Japan itself. Apparently you failed to ever acknowledge receiving this report. I'm wondering if you have any recollection of having received it, and if you did, what was your response to that report?
I don't recall that specific report. I know that there was mention that maybe there should be a test. The military and the scientists said there was no suitable island or suitable test place in the Pacific at that time where they could do a successful test to warn the Japanese.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir.
President Truman.
Okay.
Simple question. Was Pendergast correct?
Repeat the question.
Repeat the question, please.
Was Pendergast a crook?
Tom Pendergast was a big political leader in the Democratic Party in Kansas City and in Jackson County. And I was aware of people's feelings and attitudes toward him. I did not really know him very well until after I had become elected. I was a friend of his grandson and his brother who had encouraged me to run. Tom Pendergast never, ever asked me to do any favors for him at all. He was a little bit concerned. He wanted one of his cement companies, and he was in the cement business, to get the bid for laying a lot of asphalt and concrete. And I turned him down. I said, Tom, your bid's way too high. You outbid everybody. And I gave it to an out-of-state company. Tom never said anything to me again about that. He let me do whatever I wanted. And he was a good friend to me, and I went to his funeral. I got a lot of flack about that, but I didn't care. He was a good friend, and you don't turn your back on good friends.
Other questions? Yes.
This one's for Senator Smith. With your mentality, would you have preferred that that the country never went down the road towards nuclear devices? That we just completely skipped out on World War II, forgotten about the bomb?
The question was directed to Senator Smith in relationship to nuclear devices. With her perception, would she have preferred that we just totally ignored or skipped out of World War II, and particularly the issue of nuclear devices?
I would say.
Yeah, would you please stand up?
I don't know if I feel comfortable answering this, but I will say that I voted 95% of the time with my own party, and so I would say I would just feel comfortable with their decision as well.
Other questions? Sir.
Senator Goldwater,
in the election of 1964, you were characterized as being the hawk, while President Johnson was the dove, more in favor of peace. It was pointed out subsequently that he did most of the things that you were talking about. If you had been elected, how would you have conducted the war in Vietnam?
Question of the senator was, how would he have conducted the war in Vietnam if he'd been elected president of the United States?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. You see, I think first off, I think it points out the issue of straight talk. And apparently, Lyndon Johnson was being portrayed as the dove and myself as the hawk. And then he came around after the election and was a hawk. So were the American people really making a decision there? But to answer your question, communism is indeed a great evil, and it must be stopped, and it must be stopped hard, and it must be stopped with an aggressive force behind it. Now, Johnson did the right thing by stopping communism, but his involvement in the Vietnam War was done halfway. I would have gone in with full force and squelched communist intrusion, and I think we needed to stop communist intrusion elsewhere as well. And so I would have been a hawk. I wouldn't have had a nuclear war as he tried to demagogue me, but I would have done everything in my power to stop the spread of communism immediately and with less of our young men's lives, because I would be willing to commit to that cause.
Thank you. Any other questions? I have one of Francis Perkins. The question I have is, when you devised the concept of Social Security, did you ever envision that it would be a long-lived program, or did you envision that this would be abolished over a period of time and replaced with other government programs?
When I devised the program, I acknowledged that it could only have occurred because of the Depression. And I did see the Depression as a catalyst for getting some things implemented, which I had always hoped would be implemented on a permanent basis. So I didn't see it necessarily falling by the wayside or making way to other programs. I had actually hoped that it would be larger and greater scope than it was. However, I did hope that they would give the Social Security Administration to the Department of Labor. I thought that at the time, the largest appropriation in Social Security was for aid to families with dependent children. And I thought that it was only fair that women like Grace Abbott and Julia Lathrop, who ran the Children's Bureau, should be allowed the administration of that appropriation. It was a great watershed, actually, in reform movements that children's issues passed out of the hands of women at the time. So I think the only thing I would have wished differently in Social Security was that it did come under the Department of Labor.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes.
I'd like to know, how do you feel about Social Security and where it's at today and where it's headed?
I am very concerned that the money is being wasted on other programs and being misappropriated away from the Social Security Fund. However, I believe that ultimately it won't be able to be abolished and that it will be saved, because I do believe that the American people would reject completely the notion of abolishing Social Security.
Our time has come to basically close the question and answers, but before we leave, I would like to give each one of these individuals an opportunity. Yes, let's do. Each one an opportunity to tell you who they really are and what this experience has meant to them. So, Julie, let's start with you.
I'm Julie Tiger-Liegert, and I'm a staff member here at NIC. I work in the Human Resources Department. And Tony asked us all to speak to what this experience has added to our lives. And I think that for me, working in human resources, it kind of put a human face on the types of laws that we deal with every day, like the Fair Labor Standards Act, the American Disabilities Act, Family Medical Leave Act, and all the things that have come since. So since Francis Perkins is really the harbinger of a lot of modern human resource it's really been very interesting for me.
I'm Ken Pello, and from Spokane. I'm a retired high school history and government teacher. And currently, I serve as the chairman of the Spokane County Democratic Party, and so it made it very easy for me to express the ideas of Harry Truman. And I truly enjoyed this, doing this research and preparing this role very much. And I would like to say that Harry Truman, for me, even though I had covered Harry Truman in my high school teaching, this time Harry Truman, with all the reading and research I did, he became a real person for me. He became a good friend for me. And as Merle Miller, who wrote the book Plain Speaking with President Truman, Merle Miller said he was the last human being to be president. Dean Acheson said he was the most human person he had ever met. And General George C. Marshall, who perhaps ranks as next to Thomas Jefferson as one of the greatest people in American government, Marshall ranked him as one of the top 2 or 3 great men in the history of the United States of America. He proved that an ordinary citizen could rise to become president and could really grow in the office to care about all the people.
Senator Goldwater. Thanks. My name is Dan Scheckler. I'm a student here at North Idaho College. I've always actually really admired Senator Goldwater. I guess I share a similar libertarian philosophy as he does. I'm a pacifist, actually, so I don't really share his aggressiveness on foreign policy matters. Something I thought was interesting when I was studying him, he was a really poor student in high school, as was I, and he never graduated college either, as I haven't yet either, so I guess I share a lot in common with him. But overall, his commitment and his integrity to reality and what he believed in, and to say that, I have a lot of respect for that, so that's why I chose this character.
Dan is also North Idaho College's student body president, and has done a great job in that capacity. He is more modest than Goldwater, absolutely. Senator Smith.
My name is Trina Runge Wecker, and I'm a counselor advisor here at North Idaho College, and actually assistant women's basketball coach. Let's see. Actually, there's a few similarities between myself and Margaret Smith. One is I just recently took my honeymoon in Maine, so that was kind of interesting. I wish I would have known I was a character before I went, but also she didn't actually get involved in politics until she was around my age, and until then she really wanted to be a teacher and educator, and also she helped out with the basketball team, so I thought that was kind of interesting as well. And then just interesting to see how she progressed and how hard she worked, and so very admirable lady. Thank you.
Thank you for President Wilson.
My name is Bart Hagan, and I'm from Spokane, former teacher and coach at Rogers High School. And I'm very much involved in and have been very activist in politics and environmental work. I also do radio commentary on KBBX. I was really quite interested in President Wilson from the standpoint that he's considered one of the great presidents and one of the top 3 usually. And in looking up his material and learning about him, I realized that he really did have a dark side. That he really would, he sent American troops into Russia to fight the Red Russians right after the First World War was concluded, and or actually during the First World War. So I was really interested in looking at him as a really 3-dimensional person, because I'm rather suspicious perfect heroes and people that are always considered to be the best in their field. I was very much involved in the anti-war movement and in the involvement with Vietnam, and campaigned very hard against Goldwater. I always remember the slogan that he ran under, you know, in your heart, you know he's right. And we used to go to those rallies, and when they would say, in your heart, you know he's right, we would chant, in your gut, you know he's nuts. And I always remembered that part.
Thank you. Once again, I'd like to thank each one of you for attending this afternoon. Quick reminder, this evening at 7 o'clock, there is another response panel here in the Student Union. And for those of you that can make it, I'm sure it'll be a great time. Thank you all so very, very much.
Thank you so much. Great.
Hey, Brenda, thanks. And I was sorry I was running over. I was trying to chop. I was trying to chop out there.
I was giving you 20 seconds here, 20 seconds there.